Alright, so story of migration in my life. I'm born and bred in Utah, but I moved around a lot when I was young because my parents, they used to flip houses, I guess. And for a while we used to jump around houses that we couldn't afford. It was a lot of reasons. But what happened was my dad grew up where I live now in Pleasant View, Utah. And so I started my life out in Ogden, Utah. Then I moved to Layton. And then I moved back to the same house in Ogden because it was one my grandparents owned. And then we moved to Pleasant View, high up. And then we moved to North Ogden to a condo for a summer. And then we moved back to Pleasant View and in a different house, and that's where we've been for the past 10 years, and it's kind of weird to have lived there for so long. But what makes my story of circular interesting is that since my dad grew up where I lived, is that I went from going to a private school where no one knew who I was. I was one of 2 Mormon kids, I think, in my whole grade. And I don't identify as Mormon now, but back then it was real weird. And then I went to a school that my grandma had taught at. And there were still teachers there from when my grandma had been teaching, 30 years ago. And there were also teachers that my grandma taught or my dad went to school with. And so I had to make a shift from people not knowing who I was and being able to kind of establish myself on my own to people having preconceived notions of who I was, mostly because my dad was a little shit growing up. And so I had to deal with a lot of people thought I was my aunt's daughter because I was good at school and I didn't dump soap in anything. And I wasn't a little shit. And so it was growing from grade school to high school. I just had to learn how to deal with if people could say my last name right, because it's got an H in there and that throws people off. If people could say it, that means they either knew German, which was unlikely, or they knew my family, and I had to quickly figure out which part of my family they knew, because if it was my grandma, I'd be set because everyone loved her. If it was my dad, I'd be screwed for half of a year. And that's my story.
This is the story of how I came to Utah. I had just gotten my master's and I was applying for jobs, and I got a fellowship at the Utah Museum of Fine Arts. I had never been to Utah in my life. I had never really thought about Utah or Salt Lake until I was accepted. And so I found myself, I think it was in August, driving for 2 days across the country to Salt Lake with my mom in my Jeep, and I had all of my belongings in there. I didn't bring anything else. Well, I guess I did ship a mattress out there so that I wouldn't have to buy one. And it was a long and boring drive, and I remember entering the canyon in between Park City and Salt Lake. I'm not sure what it's called. I was on 80. And yes, Parley's. And I was getting really excited because it's a beautiful canyon. And before then, this scenery was a little bleak. So I was like, yes, finally, this is what I was envisioning. And all of a sudden, I see red and blue lights go off behind me. And I thought, oh no. So I pulled over, and a cop came up to my window. I think his name was Wendell or something like that. It was kind of a unique name. And he told me I was speeding. I was going, I believe, 90. Or no, I was going 80 in a 65 zone. So I was speeding quite a bit. And he asked me if there was any reason for speeding, and I told him that I was just moving from Indiana to Utah, and I didn't know what the speed limit was. And he looked over, and he saw my mom, and I think he felt bad for me. And he let me off with a warning. And so I thought, well, what a great welcome to Utah. So that's my story of migration.
Hi, my name is Andrew McGuire. So my story of migration is I'm just going to give a little, like a brief history of my family's migration. From looking at like last names, looks like my entire family came pretty much from the English Isles in general. From my dad's side, it was Ireland and Scotland, and my mom was pretty much just English as far as I know. But so my mom's family came over, I mean, according to like the family myth, it's like supposedly they came over on the same boat as William Bradford, but like I think that's a lie. But on my mom's side, I know that my grandpa lived in Hope, Arkansas. He like helped his mom run a farm in Hope, Arkansas for a long time. So his mom was like impregnated by this dude who essentially then just like bailed. And so he's like turn of like the 20th century or something. He's like a poor ass kid. And but I think so that was my mom's dad. I think my mom's mom was from the South, which means that I probably have slave owners in my history. It's kind of fucked up. Like, I don't know what crimes my ancestors committed. Like, that's just a whole history that's like, I don't know. That's partially unavailable to me, partially because I think my family doesn't want to go into it. Like, I don't think anyone wants to really excavate that if it is kind of scary and very like bad. But yeah, so but eventually on my dad's side, he's like first generation Irish immigrant. And they lived in Long Island, and it's just kind of weird that like my family didn't really have any reason, like my parents met when they were in California, and they didn't really have any reason for coming to Utah other than just like jobs, like economic things. Like they didn't have any history, they didn't have any connection to the land or like the actual history or culture of Utah. I don't think any of them, I don't think either of them really knew. And then once they got here, they were together for a long time, but they didn't end up splitting up. It was just kind of weird. Like there's like all this history leading up to them meeting in California, and then my life, which is being in Utah, and it's like I don't know how consequential it is. Mm-hmm. So, but that's pretty much it. That's the whole migration.
So I've already started it.
So I'm actually going to tell not personally like my story of migration, but sort of how I came to understand migration. So I grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere in Idaho, and ever since I could remember, we had a farmhand named Willie, and he was Mexican, and he would come every year during like the harvest season and stay for work on our farm for like half the year, and then go back home to Mexico to spend like the winter with his family. And but I mean, I was really young when I first met Willie, and he was just always around, and like I would ride on the back of the four-wheeler with him and like go through the fields and everything. And like I knew that English wasn't his first language because he had an accent, but it never, for such a long time, it never occurred to me like how far away Mexico and his family really was. Like I kind of always thought like, oh, they were just a state away, a few hours, a couple of hours away. And this was like before the time of internet. Well, not before but in the middle of Idaho, it was before the time of internet. And I don't know, just looking back, that like was so surreal when I finally realized like what an effort it was for him just to work, you know, and that he had to like be away from his wife and his children who were growing up for half of the year, but he never complained. And he, like, I don't know, we always considered him as part of our family as well. Like, he would celebrate the holidays that he was there for with us, and he was like one of the first people that we called when my grandmother passed away. And yeah, so that's Lily, like, really put the idea of migration into perspective for me.